Hello, welcome to this Ned Davis Research podcast, where we will help you see the signals. My name is Brian Sanborn, NDR's Global Head of Investment Solutions. In this episode, we'll be speaking with NDR's Chief Economist, Alejandra Grindal, about the global economy. Alejandra, post-Liberation Day, what is the expected trajectory of the global economy?
Hey, Brian, thanks for having me again. So, although reciprocal tariffs were eventually delayed and Chinese tariffs have temporarily been reduced, a great deal of uncertainty persists. And until deals, which do take some time, come into fruition, this uncertainty will likely delay or eliminate new business spending. Meanwhile, any eventual tariff or counter tariff will reduce the benefits of comparative advantage and thus cut potential growth globally. As a result, we officially reduced our global real GDP growth forecast for this year to 2.7% from 3.1% previously. And this would put growth slightly above the 2.5% threshold, consistent, or at least historically consistent, with global recession, or what we would call a more severe global slowdown, but obviously leaves less wiggle room. Looking at the data, the freshest post-Liberation Day data already shows a global economy that is slowing, led by the US, but also some of the economies most adversely impacted by US tariff policy, so specifically Canada and Mexico. But so far, most data are far from historically deep recession thresholds, which again provides a bit of a buffer. Going forward, also, we expect continued monetary and fiscal support from most of the world to provide a modest offset to this uncertainty.
Have tariff concerns caused global trade to dry up?
Well, not at this time. So several economies, and so far this is mostly in Asia, have reported trade figures for April. The expectation was that given the higher baseline due to prior front loading, and this was particularly evident in China, as well as this heightened uncertainty I mentioned, we would see some sort of weaker export figures for April. But instead, year-to-year export growth has not only remained positive, but in some cases even accelerating, just sort of indicating resilience to these US tariff threats. Annual growth in exports among several large Asian exporters, so this includes China, Taiwan, and Vietnam, soared in April. And so far, all the major economies that have reported exports for April show positive year-to-year expansions that are above their 3-year average.
How has China responded to the tariff news?
So actually, China was one of the first economies to report trade data for April. And the economy saw exports jump a more than expected 8.1% that month from a year earlier. With US tariffs at nearly 150% last month, Chinese exports to the US clearly plummeted and was about 21% on a year-to-year basis. But that decline was more than offset by robust gains elsewhere. So we saw 20% plus gains in exports to Germany, India, and ASEAN. And exports to ASEAN, led by Vietnam, Indonesia, and Thailand, could be a means to skirt US tariffs, indicating that growth could fade if high US tariffs are imposed on all of these economies. So in other words, we see quite a bit of breadth. Despite a recent easing of tensions between the US and China, some higher frequency data does not indicate that direct trade between the US and China is revving back up. Data on ship departures from China to the US still remain at pretty depressed levels.
How is all of this impacting inflation in the US?
Yeah, so we recently got CPI data for the month of April, and it picked up a slightly less than expected 0.2%. Showing that there has so far been little impact of tariffs over the course of that month. Core CPI, which we all know excludes food and energy, also rose less than expected 0.2%. Now, the inflation data shows little to no impact from the US tariffs in April. Now, part of the reason is that businesses had sort of front-loaded or oversized their imports in the first quarter ahead of these tariffs, so that does delay some potential price effects. But it also suggests that consumer demand may have cooled a bit because they too front-loaded, some of these big purchases in the previous few months. But we have to keep a really clear perspective here. Imports account for about 10% of all intermediate inputs to production. And most consumer spending is still on domestically produced goods and even more so services. So short supply of major supply chain disruptions, like during the pandemic, which again, we do not expect, tariffs will lead to some upward inflation pressures, but not bring us back to those, reopening pandemic highs. In fact, a recent study finds that a 10% increase in tariffs typically leads to about a 0.8% increase in CPI inflation about a year later, with a more prolonged impact over time from tariffs on intermediate goods. If the US does end up with the 10% baseline tariff, which, I think is pretty reasonable, and this, again, is on all imports, as well as perhaps some higher tariffs on some strategic sectors and countries, but exemptions on others, it would be reasonable to expect that CPI inflation in the US could sort of be at around the 3 to 3.5% mark a year from now.
Alejandra, thank you for your insights. NDR clients can read Alejandra's research in her global economic focus publications. The indicators Alejandra and the research team developed for our subscription service are also used in our model portfolios, which are available for direct delivery on TAMPs and as ETFs. For more information on NDR, we encourage you to visit ndr.com. Also, for those in listen-only mode, video versions, including the charts of See the Signals, are available by going to info.ndr.com/ndr-signals. Thank you for joining us as we help you to see the signals. So long.